Greetings and welcome back to the podcast. This episode, we are joined by Mr. McMillan, partner at Garrison Strategy, a government and public relations firm that offers advice to the resource sector on government policies and regulations, along with economic and political campaign analysis. Mr. McMillan has decades of experience at senior political levels, including serving as the Minister of Energy for Saskatchewan under Premier Brad Wall. In addition, Mr. McMillan served as the president of the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers from 2014 until 2022. Mr. McMillan earned a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of Victoria. Among other things, we discuss reading political tea leaves, social license versus public acceptance, and why advocacy is important in a democratic society. Enjoy! This podcast episode is sponsored by Enverus. Enverus is the world's largest energy-dedicated software-as-a-service company committed to helping customers close the gap between data and value creation. Enverus has been supporting the Canadian energy industry for over 30 years. Visit Enverus.com for more details. This podcast episode is powered by ATB Capital Markets. ATB Capital Markets provides financial solutions and strategic advisory services to help businesses thrive. With a track record of successful deal execution, ATB is a full-service investment dealer with a deep understanding and commitment to the industries it serves. Visit atbcapitalmarkets.com for more information. This episode is sponsored by Contango Marketing. Are you keen to learn more about the Western Canadian crude oil market? Contango Marketing is hosting a 2-day introductory course that provides comprehensive learning on logistical and commercial practices, practical insights into industry trends, and current market fundamentals. Spots are limited, so register now at contangomarketing.ca. This episode is brought to you by Upgrade Labs. Upgrade Labs offers a comprehensive range of cutting-edge performance and recovery services that have been proven to optimize your health in minutes, not hours. Whether it's accelerating muscle mass and bone density or addressing injury and inflammation, start your experience by booking a free cell health analysis at upgradelabs.com/Calgary. Okay, well, we're recording now. So good morning, Mr. McMillan. Thank you very much for doing this. I appreciate your time.
Good morning.
For the listener, you are the partner at Garrison Strategy, but what is Garrison Strategy?
So me and my three partners, we're resource specialists, oil and gas. We do policy, regulatory, government relations, advocacy for resource companies. I think that we see a gap where the resource sector, and oil and gas specifically, sometimes has a very poor understanding of how governments operate, of how policy and regulatory issues come forward, and how to navigate it. So that's what we do.
You've had a pretty interesting career thus far. So I thought for the purposes of today's conversation, we could structure it around kind of a chronological order and maybe get into some current events, if that's okay with you.
Perfect. Sounds great.
Why did you start Garrison Strategy? Maybe just to start at Garrison.
It goes back to that we certainly see a gap, that there is huge opportunity for resources, for Canadian resources, specifically oil and gas. The global demand is increasing. Canada has incredible reserves. We have very technically competent workforce, but we keep getting in our own way. And it's usually policy, regulatory, and politics that are limiting our ability to get pipelines, to get efficient operations. And we want to be a part of it. We think our skill set is somewhat unique, and we can play an important role. And with some changes in government that look to be imminent, in not just federally, but also potentially on our west coast with BC, we really could be in an interesting place where Canada starts to achieve some of its potential.
For the business aspect of this podcast, how does Garrison make money?
We work for mainly resource-based companies. We do have a few other clients that are in other industries, but yeah, we help them with strategy. We help them understand what governments are saying. We help them with to put forward ideas that they think are important or would be good policy or regulatory for Canadians in a way that politicians and bureaucrats and senior officials can understand and hopefully get a good outcome that makes Canada a better, safer, more prosperous place.
How did you get into energy and why? To go back in time.
So probably jump all the way back to the start there. Grew up on a farm in Saskatchewan. At the time that farming in Saskatchewan was a tough business, and oil and gas around Lloydminster started up in the 80s, or I guess it was going well before that. But the first landman came and knocked on our door and said, we'd like to drill a well. And that was a pretty exciting day on the McMillan farm. And from that point forward, my family has been very involved. We have owned heavy equipment. We've had service companies, an uncle that had a service rig company that we all worked on at different points. And when I graduated from university, I moved back to the farm, started ranching and started buying heavy equipment and started a service company. So that's really where it started. Had an opportunity in government to be the energy and mines minister, which was fantastic. And it's really been an important part of my career all the way through.
You did a econ degree at UVic.
That's right.
I'm correct?
Yeah. Victoria wasn't and still isn't particularly friendly to the resource sector, but feel like I got a good education and have been using the econ degree to advance resources ever since.
In 2007, if I'm correct, you were elected as an MLA in Saskatchewan?
That's right. I was part of Brad Wall's government when we got elected in 2007. We were running a business in Saskatchewan, an oil field business and ranching, and was pretty frustrated with continually electing NDP governments that we didn't feel were supportive of the businesses that we were in or the community in which we were a part of, and finally got frustrated or involved enough and put my name on the ballot and got elected in the riding of Lloydminster.
So that wasn't always the plan to be a politician?
No. It was something I was always interested in. I didn't really think that I would want to take my career that way. I viewed myself as an entrepreneur. But after a couple successive, frustrating elections, got increasingly involved in the local SAS Party riding association. And then the opportunity presented itself to run for the nomination. And I originally crumpled up it was another candidate that was running for it. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. And I put it in the garbage. Came back about 4 hours later and went through the garbage. And I'm like, man, I wonder if I should be more involved. Talked to my wife, who I thought would pour cold water on it, and she didn't. So then we called up the retiring MLA and said, would you go for dinner? And had a good discussion. And from that point on, it's been a lot of work, but it's been a pretty rewarding period of time for us when we were involved.
And then you ended up as Minister of Energy in the end?
In the end, I was in the rural health file. But yeah, when I got elected in 2007, I was a backbench rural MLA from Lloydminster. A couple of years in, got asked to join cabinet and be the Minister of Crown Investments Corporation, the body that runs the Crown corporations in Saskatchewan and several of the Crowns. And then I got asked to take on energy and mines. That was where my passion was. So that was a portfolio that I found the most interesting.
Mr. Brad Wall had a good run as Premier of Saskatchewan. When you met him, did you get a sense that you guys were in for a good stretch?
It felt like Saskatchewan was primed for change. For a long time, the NDP were the natural governing party for 70 years. There was a couple short stints in there where right of center parties would get elected. But Brad did a phenomenal job of talking about why free enterprise is important, why Saskatchewan's culture and makeup and values were those of entrepreneurs, of hard work, developing our resources and our businesses and succeeding, that we weren't a province that had to take a backseat to anyone. And I think he was one of the most powerful things he did. I think he changed the way Saskatchewan people saw themselves. And today they have far more confidence than I think we did in the 90s and 2000s. We now feel that we should be sitting at any table that's important at Federation, at the Council of the Federation. And I don't think that we're going to go back to a we province or left of center province anytime soon.
As an entrepreneur who was involved in the business scene of Saskatchewan, did you get a sense at the time that the economy was really blossoming in Saskatchewan and that was contributing to the success of the province and Mr. Brad Wall's policies?
Yeah, I think that for a long time we were told that we were too small to be important, that we had to take what we were given, that we shouldn't push back against, federal intrusions. And Brad just said, articulated on behalf of the party and the cabinet, that Saskatchewan should take the steering wheel, that we should drive our own destiny, and that resource, that agriculture, that, many businesses that we were going to be capable of being leaders in. And I would say the people of Saskatchewan, the businesses of Saskatchewan stepped up and proved him right. And today we see massive investments in the world's largest potash mine is going to come on stream in the next couple of years. It's going to fundamentally change the potash industry around the world. When you look at uranium, Canada has some of the largest resources and is one of the largest producers. Agriculture, oil and gas, you name it. Opportunity is at our footsteps in Saskatchewan, as it really is in Alberta and BC. Canada is a blessed country, and the more we can get out of our own way, the better we'll be. We produce all the products we produce responsibly, thoughtfully, safely, as we should. And we'll continue to improve on that, I'm certain. But I think we have an obligation to continue to be the world's best producer of all the products that we have.
At the time, or even now, how would you describe yourself politically? Maybe right of center, lowercase c conservative, lowercase l liberalism, libertarian?
Maybe libertarian in some senses, certainly passionate about free enterprise and the role that entrepreneurs can play. I think broadly would identify with right of center or conservative parties as they are in Canada. But really, since I left the Saskatchewan Party, and the Saskatchewan Party was a united liberal and conservative parties of Saskatchewan united to become the Saskatchewan Party. Since I left there, I took on a role which was nonpartisan at CAPP, and today, I'm not a member of any political party, but I am certainly a fan of some and supportive of some. But yeah, I would be on the right side of the spectrum.
On the subject of CAPP, in 2014, I think, is when you became president. So why did you join CAPP?
Going back to my early days, the oil and gas is something that was very important to our family. When I started a business, it was both agriculture and energy service. It's where I see huge opportunity. And when I got asked to be the Energy and Mines Minister in Saskatchewan, it was really my dream job. It was the one role that I would have wanted had I been in government for 20 years. So when CAPP asked if I would be interested in getting involved there and being the president and CEO, it really felt like the right thing to do. It was a time where I think the oil and gas industry was struggling. The opponents had turned their sights from forestry to oil and gas about 5 years earlier. They were blocking pipelines. They were trying to stop LNG facilities. They were trying to stop the oil sands. I guess looking from a political seat at the industry, it looked like they needed some help with somebody who had political acumen. It was a very interesting time, very challenging time. And then the economics of oil and gas changed very quickly, almost immediately. The oil started to fall in the end of 2014 fairly substantially, and it was pretty tough for several years.
Did you know that at the time that you were facing some major headwinds and that this wasn't going to be an easy time in the sector?
I certainly wasn't naive to the challenges of the activist groups that had targeted oil and gas. I knew that really was going to be the basis of the job. Had no insight I didn't have a crystal ball to see that the price of oil was going to go down to $26 within the year and then stay relatively low for the next several. Maybe the other one that I didn't see is when I joined CAPP, there was pro oil and gas governments really across Canada. The Liberals were pro LNG in BC. Alberta had a conservative government. Saskatchewan had the Sask Party. Manitoba had a conservative government. In the in Ottawa, we had Stephen Harper, who had talked about the oil and gas industry being very important and was relatively supportive of its growth. And within a year of joining CAPP, all of those had changed except Saskatchewan. It was the only one that stayed a very pro-oil and gas government. We had NDP in BC, we had NDP in Alberta, and we had the Liberals in Ottawa. And all of them were talking about energy transition and off oil and gas and phasing out the oil sands over time, and just very challenging policy perspectives to operate in that were largely inconsistent with global demand growth. On one hand, we were seeing the world was using more oil and gas. Well, some of the Canadian political leaders were talking about something that was just almost imaginary.
In the fall of 2015 is when things changed big time federally. Do you remember that October? And what were you thinking at the time?
I remember it very well. I think that the federal election that happened in October happened the day before the CAPP strategy session, where we talk about big picture and where we're going and what the priority is going to be. And though the Liberals, who were then elected, had campaigned on, hadn't talked about a carbon tax, were fairly silent about energy policy, there were enough signals that we knew it was going to be very different. And I think we were a little naive to how challenging it was going to be to work with them. But within a year and a half to 2 years, it became very apparent. And Bill C-69 and the moratorium on shipping and the Arctic moratorium, the list got fairly long, fairly quick, that their view was that they were going to force an energy transition, even if one wasn't going to happen because citizens wanted it, regardless of the cost.
Sometimes it's difficult to figure out what people are going to do. There's a difference between what people say and what they're thinking. Have you learned to kind of read between the lines through the years on what policies are going to come down the pipe?
I think that I have a fairly good political radar, having been in that business for long enough that when you get a few words that don't quite add up, they usually are signaling something. And one of the biggest challenges at CAPP would be reading the tea leaves and having a good sense of where something was going. But working within an organization that had leadership from a lot of the companies, from our members, that at times didn't want to believe the tea leaves. I can think of like Bill C-69, the challenge to kind of build an opposition to something that seemed very problematic, but challenging for industry to believe that a government would do something that is so damaging to its citizens. We would get someone in the Prime Minister's office would call a CEO and tell them that, we understand your concern and we're going to fix it in the second draft. And I don't personally believe they ever were considering fixing it, but it bought them enough time to push the ball. Ultimately, our industry and several others realized that this is an existential threat, that this bill is a problem, and we were able to put a fairly strong opposition, make it very public so that Canadians knew that this was going to be bad for Canada. And I think that though it passed, it really set the seeds for Canadians to understand that this means increased costs for them, less opportunities for them and their children. And I think that it will be changed at some point in the future to something that meets our needs of high environmental and safety standards, while enabling us to reach our potential when it comes to resource development. But that's kind of a long answer to reading the tea leaves is only half the problem. The other half is building a coalition of folks that are willing to push back against things that are going to be problematic.
Sometimes regardless of what sector it is, there's a separation between reality and the industry and insulated politicians. Did you get a sense that may be occurring in the government the last, say, 10 years? There's a big difference between reality and policies?
Absolutely. And I think that that's a nature of politics, and why advocacy is so important. That maybe in the 1960s and 70s, the model was that big business would take a politician for a steak dinner and talk about what would be good policy, and that would carry the day. I certainly wasn't born yet at that point, but today it is a very transparent business in some ways. And the transparency is, if there's something that you think is important that seems counter to where the government is going, you should talk to them respectfully and you should engage with them about what you think a better option is. But to get change, it inevitably takes getting Canadians on side and talking to Canadians. And that's advocacy. And there's several groups in the oil and gas space that do a great job of advocacy, of informing Canadians about energy policy, about connecting it to the daily lives of Canadians. What does this policy that seems targeted at upstream producers, how does that affect the average Canadian when they're filling up their car or trying to heat their home? And increasingly, without the advocacy, it is going to be tough to get political leaders to change direction, because people get elected or people are willing to put their name on the ballot. It's not a great job. It's got a lot of downside, but people run for office because they believe in something. Ideology is a good thing, but people have different ideologies. And if you want to, I may be a little bit negative on the current government in Ottawa, that their ideology is they want an energy transition. And if one isn't going to happen naturally, they're going to force it. They're going to put in electric vehicle mandates where you can no longer drive a Ford truck with a gasoline engine. They're going to put an emissions cap. Regardless of if the world's using more oil and gas, Canada's going to produce less. These things may not be reasonable, but it's aligned with their ideology. And it's only through engaging the public that can push back and at some point elect a different government with a different ideology that we have a better, stronger country.
From the perspective of a politician, that many would say that's the point. They're supposed to be insulated, not swayed by industry and public opinion. But regardless of sector, whether it's tech or oil and gas, it seems like there's at times a massive knowledge gap. Did you notice that?
I don't know if governments should be insulated. I think that it's good for political leaders, elected people, to engage widely and to get lots of different perspectives. But I also think that to be a good politician, you have to have a strong ideological basis. What do you believe in? What are your values? And you should express those values and those beliefs during campaigns that then get you elected. And you continue to take input. But in democracies, after a period of time, change is inevitable. And I think the more you engage with the public as an industry about the issues that are important to your industry, potentially that can help shape governments that are in office to a certain point within their ideology. And when change is needed, democracy does that as well.
You're a little biased, but do you think advocacy works?
Yeah, I definitely think it works. I think it's crucially important. It's part of the democratic process. And advocacy can range from education. It can range from on the ground door knocking and talking to people about issues. It can be online Facebook campaigns. It can be very political. It can be very educational. It's all sorts of things are advocacy. But without it, we don't have an informed public about key issues like how you heat your home and how food gets to your table. I think it's a public service almost. And if I could just add one more point, Pierre Poilievre has been extremely public to industry across Canada and quite critical of some. He has said, if you think that our government, if elected, should do some policy, don't tell me, the leader of the party, don't tell the members, tell Canadians. If we hear about whatever change or whatever issue that you think is important on 100, on 1,000 doorsteps, it's going to become important. But if you think a discussion with a senior political leader is what it takes, that isn't how it works, which I can't believe he had to write an opinion editorial and give several speeches on this topic, but he did. And that's just the truth.
How come you left CAPP?
I was there for almost 8 years and I enjoyed it very much, but it was time that it's one of those jobs that kind of like throwing a rock in your backpack every couple miles when you're hiking. After a while, you got a lot of rocks in your backpack, and I enjoyed it. I think that you take on a lot of these challenges and you build campaigns and coalitions to push back against different bills like C-69 or the emissions cap or the tanker moratorium. And I did it with a smile. I enjoyed it. After 8 years, it was I didn't feel like I had that same passion anymore. And maybe the backpack had too many rocks in it. And I just felt like this is the type of job that you should just be grinning ear to ear to take on the next fight or the next challenge. And it was time. So I left on great terms, and I think it was time for renewal, and that's exactly what they did.
This podcast episode is sponsored by Conate Water Solutions. Do you need cost-effective water sourcing options to supply your next drilling or completions program? Conate Water Solutions is a specialized hydrogeology company focused on water well drilling, testing, and water management services in Western Canada and Texas. Contact info@conatewater.com or check out conatewater.com for more details. This episode is brought to you by the Canadian Gas Association. The Canadian Gas Association represents Canada's natural gas delivery industry, whose members include distribution companies, transmission companies, equipment manufacturers, and other service providers. The Canadian Gas Association members deliver safe, reliable, and affordable natural gas to meet 38% of Canada's energy needs. Visit cga.ca to learn more about Canada's natural gas. Well, maybe some current events and random questions, if that's okay with you.
Absolutely.
Given your experience at CAPP, how do you evaluate the current Canadian energy policies, and what areas, if you were to put your finger on, need the most improvement?
I'm quite frustrated by current energy policies, and some of the ones that are hanging over our head right now and may be brought into law in the last year of the current government. The fact that global demand for oil and gas has increased consistently over the last decade. Our federal government has canceled numerous pipelines, Northern Gateway. After it had gone through cabinet, it was canceled. Energy East, the company pulled back from it. Major oil sands projects like the Teck mine, the federal government sat on it until the company pulled it the day before cabinet had to make a decision. We had 16 LNG facilities that were trying to get through the regulatory process. Today, I think we have one under construction, one starting construction. We are not reaching our potential by far at a time that our allies around the world are coming to Canada with their hat in their hand saying, we need your help, that Russia is a problem and we are captive. Will you supply natural gas? Will you build LNG facilities? And the current policy and the current message from our government is, no, we don't think there's an economic case. Well, there is, if the policies that are stopping it would get out of the way. So I'm quite critical. But that also makes me very optimistic that with some changes, our huge competitive advantages are going to enable Canada to be a great supplier of very high quality products, natural gas and oil being two of them.
Do you think the current geopolitical instability will help contribute to the business case for Canadian oil and gas products?
Sadly, yes. There are very few democracies with high environmental and social standards that have the type of resources we do. And I almost feel like it's an obligation Canada should have to its allies is to be a supplier of choice. The reality is that because we have limited our ability to develop and export our products, we're seeing coal at an all-time high. Our allies are burning coal in Europe because they can't get access to enough natural gas, which has double the greenhouse gas emissions. Now, I think coal is another product that makes people's lives better, that there's 1 billion people around the world that can't turn a light bulb on, that are living in abject energy poverty. And the same people that have attacked oil and gas have attacked coal, ultimately leaving billions of people without enough food, without enough light, and lower standards of living than they would otherwise have. But again, I think there's more upside than downside at this point, and I think that globally we are seeing a maturity of thinking around energy issues that is going to enable more people being pulled out of poverty.
If there's one significant regulatory challenge that you think about today in the energy sector? Which one would you point towards or give as an example?
The most iconic and potentially the biggest actual would have to be the Impact Assessment Act, Bill C-69. It's one that when it was introduced in the House, we did a pile of work to understand it. It was very problematic. We ran a campaign.
Oh, maybe for the listener, what is...
The Impact Assessment Act is what major projects need to get an approval to be built, be that a pipeline, be that an LNG facility, be that an oil sands project, a nuclear power plant. Just major infrastructure needs approval under the Impact Assessment Act. So we looked at it in great detail. We built a coalition. We tried to get it changed. We worked with government. We tried to get it changed. We worked with the Senate. Ultimately, they passed something that was very problematic. And ultimately, the Supreme Court has ruled on it now that it is unconstitutional, that the federal government has overstepped and that it needs substantial change. The federal government has made some changes that do not address the problems that the Supreme Court has pointed out. So this is going to continue to be an anchor on Canadians. If you look at the major projects that are currently being finished, the Trans Mountain project or Site C, all the major projects that are now coming to an end, all of those were largely approved under the previous federal government, for one, and we are not seeing new major projects coming, even being introduced under the current Impact Assessment Act, because no one's going to spend the $1 billion to get a project into a process that has very little chance of success. And without that, we are going to be a very stagnant country. So if I had one hope for the next couple of years or the early years of a new administration in Ottawa, it would be to look at that act and make the changes as the Supreme Court has suggested, as well as changes that would enable Canada to be a supplier of choice of energy products and other products around the world.
Regardless of whether there's a federal change in politics, or maybe if there is, how do you see Canadian energy policy evolving in the next 5-10 years? Where do you see it going?
I think it's fundamental. If there is a change in Ottawa, we have an opportunity to position Canada for success on a global stage. If there isn't a change, there is no chance. That the current government has clearly said on a number of occasions that they are driving an energy transition, whether it's going to happen naturally or not. And the costs associated with that are costs that Canadians are just going to have to bear. And what it means is Canadians will start importing more oil than we are today. And today we are importing oil into Eastern Canada, which is ironic with the amount we have here in West. We aren't going to be a large exporter of LNG, even though the world needs more of it. So for me, it's a pretty binary world that the potential is huge as global demand increases, and specifically looking to countries like Canada to be that supplier. But if we don't have a different perspective in a federal government, we aren't going to meet that potential. We aren't going to be able to make minor tweaks to current legislation to get us any change. It's going to take thoughtful assessment of something like the Impact Assessment Act and several other acts and policies to say Canada is going to work to achieve its potential.
The idea is not to forget the environment, but you can either deal with it in a carrot or a stick. To what extent do you think the carbon tax has been a failed policy with negative incentives that just doesn't work?
I think that's a great point. That one of the most frustrating things, I think, in my time in government or at CAPP is people that would try and pit the energy sector against environmental performance. Having been deeply involved as the regulator in Saskatchewan, as a minister, you're responsible for the regulatory agency, or at CAPP, working with companies directly. Environmental performance is core to the businesses we operate, and it should be. We are a prosperous, democratic country that takes the environment very seriously, and we have been on a path of continuous improvement. The irony is that when we put policies that are not thoughtful in place, We drive up coal consumption around the world because there is not access to a better fuel, which there should be. We put taxes in place in Canada that are not in competing jurisdictions with far lower standards. By taking Canada, one of the highest performing jurisdictions, out of that global market, we are really just enabling other countries with lower standards. So it's one of those perverse outcomes that virtue signaling has a very negative effect on global outcomes, even though it may make some people feel good or warm and fuzzy at home. And I don't think that that's what most Canadians want. They want to see Canada reaching its potential and supporting global initiatives, not just patting ourselves on the back for being virtuous.
The theory is that when you tax something, people use less of it, but the problem is that it's an open economy and people get their products elsewhere. Long story short.
Absolutely. That you put a tax in one place and not somewhere else, it just pushes it out. And people are going to heat their homes. People can turn down the thermostats. Like domestically, we can tax Canadian citizens. We can double the carbon tax. We can raise it from $10 to $70 to $170, where it's ultimately targeted to go. People are still going to heat their homes, and they should. We can do it safely. We have standards for insulation and furnaces, but people are going to heat their homes. So no tax in the world is going to force people to stop driving to work, to get their kids to hockey practice or soccer practice. If that's the objective, is to people will use less of it. I just don't think that's part of Canada or the type of Canada that I or most people want to be a part of.
How much does social license play into the energy products in Canada today? How important is it to get all stakeholders involved in projects that are being built?
I'm a little nerdy when it comes to some of this, and I think words matter a lot. The words social license, that phrase, I think, is inappropriate. A license to do something is a very important regulatory tool that regulators need to give licenses based on evidence, based on technology, based on outcomes. And when we water down the word license to say social license, which no one can really define, it means something slightly different to everyone. That's not just inappropriate. It starts to erode people's confidence in the expertise of our regulators, which are exceptional and need to be. So to your broader question, it's around public acceptance is maybe something I'm more comfortable with. I think that's very important. How you measure that is sometimes challenging. That a small group of very loud voices mean you don't have public acceptance, which is the dynamic when you want to do any given project, is the incentives for very loud voices to overwhelm a broad base of support is common, and sometimes it's justified. I think Canadians start to get a little side-eyed when they see those loud voices maybe coming out of New York or California, as opposed to being more local. And we certainly have seen that in the opposition to major pipelines, that a lot of that was orchestrated out of Tides Foundation, out of the U.S., or the Rockefellers are funding the tar sands campaign. And so much of it is hiding right in plain sight in front of our eyes. You don't have to do a lot of digging to see where the base of this opposition is coming from. So to your question, I think public acceptance is very important. How you gauge that is very challenging. And that's part of the role, I think, of elected folks, is to weed through that and to understand it. But for the most part, Canadians are very supportive of natural resource and agricultural developments. And it's because we have a strong track record of doing it well and creating prosperity for Canadians in a safe, responsible way.
Sometimes in life, it's the most intolerant voice that wins. So how do you think about that? I guess when you're at CAPP and with a Canadian policy, is it, I guess, the democratic process at the end of the day? How do you approach that?
I think our industry sometimes paints ourselves into a corner, that we are an industry of smart, thoughtful people, highly educated for the most part. And we have a general belief that if the broad public or even the opposition, organized opponents from Sierra Club or Greenpeace or the Tides Foundation, if they were educated on these issues, they would see it the same way as us, which I don't think is true. I think that as ideology is an important driver for people who get into political life, ideology is even more important to people that get heavily involved in activist groups. But I think first and foremost, anything we do has to be of the highest standards, that our regulators, the laws that we're putting in place need to be responsible and thoughtful. Companies that operate in Canada have to share our values. And that's just table stakes before we start. If we want to do a major project, it takes work engaging stakeholders, local communities, and continually communicating with them. But doing all of that right and having a great project doesn't mean that we won't get loud opponents, potentially not even from Canada, that try and clog up our airways and silence the conversation. And we just have to be a strong, proud nation that finds a path to get the right outcomes.
What are Canada's competitive advantages in the global marketplace for energy? If you were to sell our product, if you were to pitch it?
It's an embarrassment of opportunities and embarrassment of advantages. The first and foremost is you can't fake the rock, that we have incredible reserves of bitumen, of crude oil, of natural gas, onshore, offshore. That's number one. Number two is the second largest coastline in the world, and the largest border with a single country in the world to the U.S., who is the largest consumer of oil and gas. Shorter shipping times to the major markets in Asia, that, on every metric, we have it. And then you put on top of that a educated, sophisticated workforce. Some of the best schools, universities, technical schools in the world to have a workforce that's motivated and capable of executing. Across the board, we are very well positioned, which I think gives me great confidence that in the medium term, the momentum will come back and the wind will be at our backs to be that supplier for our allies around the world that need us to do more and be better.
Well, that's a lot of current events and policy questions. Maybe to touch on a lighter note, ever think about running in politics again?
No, it's one of those things that every once in a while I'm like, man, I miss it. I miss being involved. I miss the community I used to represent, but I'm also self-aware enough to know that at one point in my life, I think I was in the right headspace to maybe be somewhat good at it. And that time has passed. And I don't think I have the personality today to be effective and to do that work anymore. I'm very grateful for the time I had. I'm very appreciative of anybody who will put their name on a ballot. And I want to support folks that will, because it's a tough job, but it's a very important one. But for me, that time has passed.
Biggest opportunity in the Canadian energy sector, is it oil sands, LNG, SAGD, kind of the smaller guys?
I think it's all of the above.
All the above.
The one thing that I would say is that Canada has always had an entrepreneurial engine that have started companies and found new resources, and then those resources become mainstream. If I were to say maybe not the biggest opportunity, but one of the things I think we need to be really thoughtful of is ensuring that we maintain that entrepreneurial engine to keep the whole industry fresh. That when you see some countries that get into the mature stage, it's because they kill off the entrepreneurs that are innovating and finding new ways of doing the work that then filters out to everybody else. So I don't think we're at risk of that, but I think we need to be very conscious of it. And that'll be one of the real strengths going forward if we can continue to enable that entrepreneurial piece that then feeds the broader industry.
You've kind of been involved with traditional oil and gas, but what are your thoughts on nuclear energy and some of the alternative energy sources? Do you think there's a role for nuclear in Alberta or in Canada?
I think about it a lot, and I'm a huge advocate for nuclear. Coming from Saskatchewan, we have world-leading uranium assets and production. I'm a big fan. I'm also frustrated. It has been the energy of the future for 60 years. I do think that it is very challenging for nuclear to compete with natural gas for power, just on a cost basis. But I'm a big supporter of it if you can get the economics right. It has struggled with public acceptability far longer than oil and gas, and it has struggled to get over it. I certainly hope that both nuclear and oil and gas get to a space where we are competing on cost, because both can be done safely and responsibly. And if it's done on cost and nuclear is more cost effective than gas, I think we should do a pile of it. If it's not, I don't. Wind and solar, maybe I'm a little more circumspect, just because I've seen the policy that enables them drives the cost of them, or hides the cost of them on the rate base, that they're intermittent. So though it's cheaper when the wind blows, the cost to sit the natural gas power plant idle is borne by the ratepayer. Again, there's going to be certain places where it makes sense. As a cattle rancher, we had solar running the water pumps. It makes sense in some places. For broad-based use, I personally am a skeptic, just because I don't think the costs are adequately assigned to their production. And if they were, we'd have very little of it. So that's maybe one man's opinion.
The reason you want nuclear and maybe some alternative energy sources is because it seems like the power grid is very fragile right now when it's minus 30 for even a week, where you get warnings to turn down the power. So how do you solve that?
The way you solve that is have less wind and solar. The biggest peak for electricity in almost every jurisdiction, probably in every jurisdiction in Canada and most around the world, the biggest peak is the coldest night of the year.
Yeah, like January, remember?
Yeah, it's always going to be the coldest night is the highest of draw when you have absolute zero wind, absolute zero solar. So when they can't contribute even a gigajoule on your highest need, then you're just carrying them because it's virtue signaling that makes you feel good. And if there was a path to making them mainstream, if batteries was ever going to be competitive so that we could store it, but we're not close to that. We're not within 50 years of that. So I'm a skeptic when it comes to wind and solar, not because I don't like wind and solar. I'll use them where they make sense on my farm. But when we're just pushing those costs, hiding those costs on the rate base, that makes me feel a little uncomfortable when we could do something better. And natural gas is so abundant and so reliable that I think that the more we can angle our system towards gas, the better.
So build more natural gas.
Natural gas, when we have hundreds of years of supply under our feet with current technology, when it can be done safely and responsibly, natural gas is a no-brainer for Western Canada. Now, the clean electricity regs, if I was to kind of circle back to our earlier conversation, the federal government are currently putting in the clean electricity regs, which makes that impossible. It is going to be extremely problematic for Albertans, Saskatchewanians, and I think it's something that is increasingly going to get the population motivated to change a government when these costs, which a decade ago were, this transition to these wind and solar, these unreliable electricity, the costs are actually negative. It's cheaper to do it and there's no downside. Today, those costs are showing up on everybody's bills. It's doubling down on inflation, and that is going to, I think, motivate people to look for better alternatives.
Because the idea is to have redundancy, and you shouldn't have to worry when you get one extra week of minus 30. And you'd think that would be pretty obvious.
You would think.
For the power grid.
Again, I don't like to go out of my way to talk negatively about energy sources that I'm not involved in. But yeah, the energy system is one or the electricity system that isn't that complex. And when you get down to your highest draw of the year, every single year is your coldest night, where you have zero of wind and solar. Like, it's that simple. So then all the costs of those wind and solar, which gets hidden on your bill, is just a cost. And we're doing it to ourselves. So, but it's been popular politically to have more wind and solar on your system, that people feel good about it, that if it doesn't cost me very much, to know that there's some wind and solar, there's a benefit to that. I know that some of the data centers, which I think is another huge opportunity for us, they like to know that there's some wind and solar on the system. Some of them will say that we will put data centers in Asia where we will use natural gas and coal. But if they're in North America, we have to have a certain portion, which are wind and solar. So it's ironic that we need to build an LNG facility to ship Canadian gas to Asia to run a data center where when it's in Canada, they have a different set of rules. But that's just the world we live in.
Also, in Alberta, with the largest natural gas or some of the largest natural gas reserves in the world, you shouldn't have to worry about when it's minus 30 to heat your home.
The tolerance of Albertans
that's crazy.
Put up with this is amazing. That if we had a blackout in this past winter when that alarm went around, that's devastating. People are dying in their homes when that happens. And we've got hundreds of years of supply under our feet. And it's just that we've been pushed to put a system in place that isn't the most efficient. It's not the most cost effective. It's aligned with the federal clean electricity regs, which are virtue signaling to someone. But that's pretty thin gruel when people are in their homes with no heat and they're freezing.
Maybe to end things, advice to a young person entering the energy industry or business in general?
All right. Well, I'm glad we're going to do this because it felt very dark, that last answer.
We're supposed to end on a light note. But,
exactly.
This is the light note.
You hear anecdotally that young people are less inclined to get involved in oil and gas. I turned 50 last year, so I've left my young person a long time ago, but the opportunity in oil and gas is so phenomenal right now that global demand increasing for the foreseeable future. The underinvestment in oil and gas means potential for some real opportunity in the next decade that for a young person, anything from technical to academic, be it engineering or trades or geology, I think the world's going to be your oyster. And my experience in this industry is one where it's a meritocracy, that if you work hard, if you are good, it doesn't matter if you're tall or short or the color of your hair, people will recognize your value and give you endless opportunity to contribute. So I don't know. I hope that young people are looking at this industry as a major stepping stone and helping to contribute to Canada's opportunity.
Well, that's it. Is there anything else you wanted to cover?
No, I think we kind of went around a lot of stuff. So really appreciate the opportunity. This was fun.
I really appreciate your time. We can end the formal conversation there. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, listeners out there. Thanks for checking out the podcast. Hopefully the episode provided some insights. If you enjoyed the show, check out trose.ca where more episodes are yet to come. You can also subscribe to the podcast where your token of support is much appreciated. Until next time, happy coffee drinking.